On the morning of February 11th, 2023, nothing in Warrington hinted at the cruelty that would later shatter its quiet rhythms. The winter air was thin and sharp, the kind that made a teenager's breath appear and vanish in quick bursts. 16-year-old Brianna Ghey, usually cautious about going out when she was not feeling well, woke up that day with a small sense of purpose someone she considered a friend had asked to meet. For a girl who often felt isolated and misunderstood, the invitation carried the weight of belonging. She dressed in her usual style, the style she had fought for, a reflection of her identity that she guarded fiercely despite the taunts she would endure for years. What she could not know was that the message inviting her out had been sent by a girl who had already marked her for death. CCTV and witness accounts would later help reconstruct her final walk. The flicker of her long hair in the cold air, her careful steps. Her face relaxed in a way that suggested she expected a normal day, maybe even a good one. She believed she was meeting friends. She believed she was safe. She believed she would be coming home. But the betrayal had already begun long before she reached the bus stop. For weeks, then months, two teenagers, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, had built a private universe of darkness. Hidden behind encrypted chats and shared fantasies, they discussed harming people the way others their age might talk about movies or classwork. Brianna appeared in those messages not as a friend, not as a human being, but as a target, an idea, a possibility. And on that morning, neither of them hesitated as they prepared to carry out the scenario they had whispered about so casually. At around midday, Brianna boarded the bus heading toward Culcheth. The ride itself was uneventful, but to imagine her sitting there holding her phone, maybe scrolling, maybe replaying conversations, invites a kind of helpless anger. A terrible contrast hung over every detail, her quiet trust versus their hidden intentions. Passengers later recalled nothing unusual. That, in its own way, is almost worse. Moments before murder, the world looked utterly normal. When she arrived, she waited near the designated meeting point. Scarlett joined her first. The two girls walked together into Culcheth Linear Park, a long green corridor of trees, open paths, and quiet corners, one of those places that feels peaceful until you realize how quickly isolation can turn dangerous. Eddie followed soon after, pretending it was a coincidence. But nothing about that encounter was accidental. Brianna walked beside them, unaware that their friendliness was part of the trap. In the hours before the attack, there were brief hints of normal teenage conversation. But underneath it, Scarlett and Eddie were exchanging silent looks, tiny confirmations of plan they carried like a shared secret. Later, prosecutors would describe the killing as a sustained and violent assault. But those words cannot fully express the moral collapse it represented. Two children walking with another child into a place where they intended to end her life. Sometime after 3 p.m., the three drifted off the main path. What happened next unfolded quickly, violently, and without warning. Brianna was struck first from behind, an act of pure cowardice. As she stumbled, confused and terrified, the attack intensified. She was stabbed repeatedly, 28 times in all, wounds to her head, her neck, her chest, her back. More than one of the blows was delivered with the kind of force that suggests not panic, but determination. The brutality was not impulsive. It was deliberate. The horror of those moments reverberated long after. Passers-by later found Brianna lying on the ground, gravely injured, her body still and silent against the cold earth. Calls for help flooded in, but it was too late. A girl who had struggled so much to live authentically, who had survived bullying, who had learned to be brave in a world that often refused to understand her, had been ambushed by the very people she believed she could trust. What makes this first chapter of the story so devastating is not just the violence, but the layers of emotional betrayal intertwined with it. Brianna had entered the park believing she was with a friend. She walked beside the person who lured her out, not knowing that the same girl had spent months imagining how to kill her. She joked. She talked. She trusted moments before she was attacked from behind. Scarlett and Eddie ran afterward. They did not panic or try to help. They fled with the cold composure of people who thought they had succeeded. When officers later questioned them, both teenagers tried to construct alibis, Their lies as calculated as the messages they had exchanged weeks earlier. They had already rehearsed how to pretend innocence. News of Brianna's death spread quickly. Shock rippled through Warrington, then across the United Kingdom. Candlelight vigils lit up city squares. Social media filled with grief, confusion, and anger. Many mourned not only the loss of her life, but the cruelty of the circumstances that ended it. A vulnerable girl manipulated, ambushed, and murdered by peers who should have been part of her community, not her executioners. Her mother later described the moment police told her what had happened. It is difficult to read her words without feeling your chest tighten. She had sent her daughter out that afternoon expecting she would return home safely. Instead, she received a knock on the door that no parent should ever face. The gap between those two realities is simple, everyday expectation of seeing your child again, and the shattering truth that she has been murdered is a space filled with unimaginable grief. As investigators began piecing together Brianna's final hours, they found no evidence that she had sensed danger, no indication that she expected violence. That in itself is a tragedy, a testament to her trust, her desire for connection, and her belief that she was meeting friends, not stepping into a premeditated trap. The first part of Brianna Ghey's story ends in that park, with a life stolen and a community suddenly forced to confront the brutal fact that two teenagers had made murder a shared goal. It ends with questions about vulnerability, trust, and the responsibilities young people have to each other that echo far beyond the crime scene. And it ends with a chilling truth. The attack was not born from chaos, but from planning. What happened in the park was only the final step in a long sequence of decisions that Scarlett and Eddie had been making for months. In the months before Brianna's murder, a darker narrative had already been unfolding, one almost invisible from the outside. It began with two teenagers who, by any ordinary measure, should have been navigating schoolwork, hobbies, and the minor dramas of adolescence. Instead, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe were sliding into a private world where violence became entertainment, then fascination, then something closer to aspiration. Their conversations, recovered from phones and cloud backups, read not like spontaneous outbursts of anger, but like the slow, deliberate construction of fantasy they were determined to make real. Their messages began innocuously enough: jokes, complaints, fragments of everyday life, but the tone shifted gradually. At first, it was Scarlett who drove the escalation, introducing topics of cruelty, torture, and killings as if probing Eddie's boundaries. He did not pull away. Instead, he echoed her interests, amplifying them. Soon they were exchanging disturbing content, videos of violence, discussions of pain, comments made with a casualness that alarmed even seasoned investigators later on. What made their conversations chilling was not only the subject matter, but the detachment with which they approached it, talking about hurting people with the same neutrality as discussing what time to meet for school. Scarlett, who would later be described as having a deep-seated interest in serial killers, seemed to thrive on pushing the boundary further each day. Eddie, socially awkward and craving connection, fell into step behind her. Together, they created a feedback loop in which each reinforced the other's worst impulses. What might have remained disturbing but idle talk for one person became, in partnership, a plan taking shape. By December 2022, their discussions had shifted from hypothetical violence to specific names. The pair compiled what prosecutors later called a kill list. Its existence alone was horrifying, but the clinical way the teenagers debated who should be targeted was even more unsettling. They talked about classmates, acquaintances, people they felt annoyed by, people they simply considered easy. They evaluated them like characters in a game rather than human beings with lives and families. Some names were dismissed quickly, too risky, too complicated, too visible. But Brianna remained on the list. For Scarlett, she was a convenient target, someone she knew, someone trusting, someone whose vulnerabilities made her less likely to question an invitation. For Eddie, the motive was murkier, buried somewhere between peer pressure, fascination with violence, and a bias he never fully admitted but could not hide. It later emerged in court that he had made derogatory remarks about Brianna's identity. Whether or not hate was his primary motive, it was undeniably woven into his perception of her. Throughout January and early February, the two teenagers refined their plan in increasingly specific terms. They discussed locations, places isolated enough to commit violence without interruption. Culcheth Linear Park came up early, its quiet paths and dense trees providing natural cover. They talked about weapons. Eddie, always eager to prove his usefulness, agreed to bring a hunting knife. They rehearsed how they would lure their chosen victim, who would strike first, how they would escape. Chillingly, they also discussed how they would behave afterward, what to say, how to act, how to avoid suspicion. What makes these messages especially hard to read is the absence of hesitation. At no point did either teenager say, "This is wrong," or "We should not do this." They egged each other on, testing boundaries and finding none. For them, the fantasy of killing merged seamlessly with the mechanics of planning it. Scarlett began grooming Brianna gently, subtly. She tried to appear friendlier, more attentive. To Brianna, who had struggled with loneliness and had been bullied in the past, this attention felt validating. A girl who had often been excluded was suddenly being included. That kind of shift can feel monumental to a teenager, like things might finally be getting better. Brianna responded with warmth. She wanted connection. She wanted normal teenage friendships. She wanted what many other girls her age took for granted. The cruelty in Scarlett's behavior lies not only in her intent to harm, but in her deliberate manipulation of that desire for friendship. She chose deceit as her weapon before a knife ever entered the picture. During this period, teachers and peers observed little to suggest the darkness beneath the surface. If anything, Scarlett appeared more engaged, still quiet, still odd in some ways, but functioning. Eddie remained socially awkward, but not dramatically more so than usual. The facade worked because both teenagers were capable of performing normalcy when they needed to. Their plan crystallized in the first week of February. Scarlett confirmed a date. Eddie confirmed he had secured the knife. They discussed logistics again, final steps that prosecutors later said demonstrated clear premeditation. Each message, each confirmation, each shared fantasy tightened the trap around Brianna without her having the faintest idea. The manipulation intensified that week. Scarlett messaged Brianna more often, hinting at wanting to hang out. It was subtle enough not to raise alarm, but insistent enough to ensure Brianna would agree. When they settled on meeting on February 11th, Scarlett relayed the details to Eddie. They had everything arranged. On the morning of the murder, the conversation between the killers was disturbingly calm. They talked about meeting times, clothing, minor details. No panic, no last-minute doubts. If anything, there was a detached excitement and eagerness to see the fantasy realized. When Eddie left his house carrying the knife, he did so with the quiet ease of someone who had rehearsed a moment in his mind enough times that the reality felt almost routine. Meanwhile, Brianna prepared for what she thought would be a normal day. She messaged Scarlett, confirming she was on her way. She chose her outfit, without knowing it would be described later in police reports. She walked to the bus stop without knowing that every step brought her closer to a betrayal, so profound it still evokes outrage from those who read the case file. Understanding the timeline of the planning is essential to understanding the moral gravity of a crime. This was not impulsive. It was not the product of a sudden argument or emotional explosion. It was sustained, deliberate, calculated. Every layer of their interaction, digital footprints, online searches, notes, voice messages revealed an unsettling truth. Two teenagers had treated the idea of killing someone as an intellectual exercise, a shared thrill, an experiment in power. As the day approached, neither backed out, neither reconsidered, neither warned Brianna. The decision to murder was already sealed long before they stepped into the park. In the end, the killing itself was simply the final step in a process that had begun months earlier, when two adolescents first found in each other the validation of their darkest impulses. The betrayal did not begin with the first stab wound. It began with the first message. And once the plan had momentum, it grew with a kind of horrifying inevitability. The tragedy of this timeline is not just its brutality, but its clarity. This was murder by design, born from fascination and executed with cold precision. In the hours following Brianna's murder, The narrative shifted from hidden planning to the cold mechanics of an unfolding investigation. What Scarlett and Eddie had imagined as a clean escape was immediately disrupted by reality panic, inconsistencies, and the simple fact that violence of this magnitude always leaves evidence behind. The facade of normalcy they attempted to project began cracking almost instantly, and investigators, trained to see past teenage composure, noticed the fissures. The first calls to emergency services came from dog walkers and passers-by in Culcheth Linear Park, who found Brianna lying motionless on the ground. The scene was both chaotic and eerily still. Officers arrived to find blood pool beneath her, the winter air amplifying a metallic scent. Paramedics attempted to revive her, but the injury's 28 stab wounds left no room for miracle. The brutality of the attack was immediately clear. The number of wounds suggested neither panic nor self-defense, but sustained, intentional violence. Within minutes, the area was cordoned off. The ground was soft from recent rain, and footprints had pressed into the mud. Drag marks, disturbances in the leaves, and the pattern of the wounds gave investigators early clues. Brianna had been attacked by more than one person, and she had been ambushed rather than confronted. The absence of defensive wounds on her hands indicated that the first blows were likely from behind. It was a detail that would later infuriate the public, an unmistakable mark of cowardice. News traveled quickly across Warrenton. Officers began canvassing the area, seeking witness statements. Someone mentioned seeing two teenagers running. Someone else reported hearing a thud, a sudden sharp sound that they had initially dismissed. No one had seen the moment of the attack, but the presence of others in the area meant that the killers had not been as concealed as they believed. Meanwhile, Scarlett and Eddie were already constructing their lives. They messaged others casually, trying to appear normal. They attempted to frame their day as uneventful. Scarlett claimed she had been at home. Eddie insisted he had gone for a walk alone. But their stories lacked the kind of detail that comes naturally to truth. More importantly, they lacked alignment. As police began knocking on doors, inconsistencies emerged immediately. Officers reached out to Brianna's family that evening. Her mother, blindsided by the news, could barely comprehend the words. Her daughter had left the house expecting nothing more than a meetup with a friend. Now officers were asking for information about who she had been with and where she had gone. When Brianna's phone data was accessed and her final communications examined, one name repeated itself, Scarlett. This became the first significant lead. Police requested an interview with Scarlett and her parents. The girl appeared composed, almost eerily calm, for someone connected to a homicide victim. She repeated her claim of having been at home, her tone flat and practiced. But officers quickly examined her phone, and the digital trail contradicted her. Deleted messages between her and Eddie were recovered. Attempts to wipe data were noted in action more damning than any careless phrase. The chat logs, once reconstructed, revealed the truth. The two teenagers had been in contact constantly that day, discussing their movements. When confronted with the inconsistencies, Scarlett's composure faltered briefly, just enough to confirm to investigators that she was withholding information. But she maintained her denial, insisting she had nothing to do with the murder. It did not matter. The evidence was already outgrowing her lies. Eddie's interview was even more revealing. Nervous, fidgeting and contradicting himself repeatedly, he quickly drew suspicion. Officers found scratches on his arms. His shoes, seized from his home, bore faint traces of blood. He claimed the scratches were from brambles during a walk. He claimed the blood was from a nosebleed. But forensic analysis had already begun, and each sample taken tightened the timeline against him. When his phone was examined, more damaging evidence surfaced. Not only had he been in contact with Scarlett throughout the day, but location data placed him near the crime scene at the exact time of the murder. Even more disturbing were the internet searches found on his device, questions about stab wounds, information about knife damage, and discussions on violent content. The messages between him and Scarlett left no doubt. They had planned the attack together. Within 24 hours, both teenagers were arrested. This decisive moment marked a shift in investigation from speculation to certainty. Forensic teams intensified their efforts. scouring the crime scene and the teenagers' homes. DNA analysis confirmed the presence of Brianna's blood on Eddie's clothing and the hunting knife recovered from his property. The weapon itself was a chilling artifact, its blade stained, its edges showing signs of force consistent with the wounds inflicted. Digital forensics formed the backbone of the case. The chats retrieved from both phones painted a chilling narrative, months of planning, explicit discussions of harming Brianna, and repeated references to killing as a shared fantasy. One message from Scarlett read almost clinically about testing pain thresholds. Another discussed choosing a location with less risk of witnesses. These were not the impulsive, scattered thoughts of troubled children. They were deliberate, organized, and deeply unsettling. Investigators were struck by the pair's detachment. In their interviews, neither showed immediate remorse. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, a lack of emotional comprehension of the magnitude of what they had done. Psychiatric evaluations later revealed troubling psychological patterns, particularly in Scarlett, whose fixation on violence had grown unchecked. As the forensic and digital evidence stacked higher, so did the anger in the community. Vigils for Brianna grew into gatherings marked by grief and collective outrage. Posters with her smiling face were placed along park paths and outside schools. People who had never met her spoke of her vulnerability, her courage in living openly as a transgender girl, and the cruelty of her final moments. The investigation concluded with an overwhelming body of evidence. The murder had been premeditated, coordinated, and carried out with chilling efficiency. Every element, messages, weapon, clothing, location data, witness statements aligned with devastating clarity. There was no mystery left to solve, only the question of how two teenagers became killers. The case now moved from detectives to the courtroom, where the full weight of their deeds would be examined in public. But long before the trial began, one fact was already indisputable. Scarlett and Eddie had not merely stumbled into violence, they had walked toward it together, step by step, leaving a trail of digital and physical evidence that exposed the darkness they had tried to hide. The trial of Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe unfolded not as a whodunit, but as a grim examination of intention, cruelty, and responsibility. By the time the case reached Manchester Crown Court, investigators had already provided prosecutors with a body of evidence so comprehensive that the question of guilt was never in dispute. Instead, the courtroom became a place where the public finally confronted the full extent of the teenagers' deception, the cold logic that guided their planning, and the anguish left behind by Brianna's death. What the world had glimpsed in headlines now took on human weight. The grief of a mother, the terror of a child's final moments, and the disturbing clarity with which the killers approached their crime. The courtroom was stark and silent when the defendants were brought in. Both were still only 15 at the time of the murder, their small frames looking almost out of place in the glass-fronted dock. It was a visual contradiction that struck many observers. They looked like children, yet they had committed an act that most adults could not comprehend. Their youth invited questions that had no comforting answers. How could such deliberate, calculated violence come from people so young? What had shaped them? And how could the systems around them have failed to detect the warning signs? Prosecutors began with what they called the architecture of the crime, the months of planning that had transformed fantasy into action. The jury was shown excerpts of the messages that had passed between Scarlett and Eddie. They were not sensationalized. They did not need to be. The words themselves were horrifying in their neutrality. Descriptions of harming people, conversations about weapons, cold assessments of potential victims, plans to lure someone to a place where they could kill without interruption. The teenagers' tone was emotionless, systematic, devoid of any sign that they understood or cared about the suffering they were preparing to inflict. The jurors shifted uncomfortably as the prosecution described the kill list the pair had compiled. It contained several named classmates, acquaintances, people who had simply inconvenienced or annoyed the teenagers. Brianna's name was not the only one, but hers was the one chosen. Prosecutors explained how Scarlett had cultivated Brianna's trust, how she used friendliness as a weapon, and how Eddie had agreed to bring a knife large enough to ensure the attack would be lethal. The chilling part, the prosecution noted, was not merely that the plan existed, but that it was refined, tested, and rehearsed. When footage showed Scarlett meeting Brianna on the day of the murder, walking beside her through Culcheth Linear Park, several members of the public gallery wept. There was an unbearable gentleness in the way Brianna carried herself, oblivious to the ambush ahead. She appeared trusting, relaxed, unaware that this was the final hour of her life. In contrast, prosecutors argued both defendants moved with purpose. They knew exactly what lay ahead. Their betrayal was as calculated as the blows they later struck. The court heard forensic evidence next. A pathologist described the injuries, 28 stab wounds delivered with considerable force. Some were immediately incapacitating. Others appeared intended to cause prolonged suffering. Several jurors visibly recoiled as the expert explained that there were no defensive wounds on Brianna's hands, confirming she never had the chance to protect herself. She had been attacked from behind, robbed not only of her life but of the dignity of facing her attackers. The clinical description of her final moments stripped away any lingering illusions about the nature of the crime. The digital forensics were equally damning. Analysts traced the teenager's movements via phone logs, location data, and deleted messages restored from backups. Attempts to wipe data were presented as proof of consciousness of guilt. The jury heard recordings of police interviews in which both defendants tried to maintain fabricated alibis. Prosecutors pointed out how quickly their lies unraveled when confronted with evidence. While the prosecution built a case grounded in methodical detail, the defense sought to humanize the teenagers. They highlighted mental health struggles, social difficulties, and the pressures of adolescence. They argued that both defendants were impressionable, caught in a toxic dynamic that fueled their worst impulses. They suggested that neither truly understood the gravity of their actions until it was too late. But even as these arguments were made, the evidence continued to tell a different story, one of planning, agency, and forethought. The prosecution countered that millions of teenagers struggle with mental health, isolation, or difficulty fitting in without conspiring to kill a peer. These factors may explain behavior, they argued, but they do not excuse murder. One of the most painful moments in the trial came when Brianna's mother gave her victim impact statement. The courtroom fell silent except for her trembling voice. She described her daughter's kindness, her sensitivity, her resilience in the face of bullying, and the courage it took for her to live authentically as a transgender girl. She spoke of the joy Brianna brought to their household, of private jokes, small routines, the little quirks that made her uniquely herself. And then she spoke of the moment officers told her that Brianna was gone to disbelief, the scream she did not remember releasing, the shattering of her world in an instant. Her grief was raw, unfiltered, and it cut through every person in the room. She said what many parents fear most: my child trusted people she should not have. She believed she was meeting friends. She did not know she was walking toward her death. Her words lingered in the air long after she sat down. As the trial drew to a close, the judge delivered a ruling that underscored the gravity of the crime. He condemned the teenager's actions as exceptionally brutal and said the planning demonstrated a level of intent far beyond impulsivity. He described Scarlett as manipulative, calculating, and consumed by a fascination with violence. Eddie, he said, was not a passive participant. He had willingly engaged in planning, brought the weapon, and carried out the attack alongside her. Both were sentenced to life in detention with lengthy minimum term sentences rarely imposed on young offenders. The judge emphasized that age did not diminish the severity of the harm they caused. In the aftermath, the community struggled to reconcile two conflicting realities: that the killers were children and that they had committed an act of adult-level cruelty. The conversation that followed touched on complex issues: youth violence, online radicalization, mental health, and the vulnerabilities faced by transgender teens. But no discussion could erase the fact that a young girl was betrayed and murdered by people she should have been safe around. Brianna's legacy became one of resilience and remembrance. Vigils were held across the UK. Her name was invoked in discussions about protecting vulnerable youth and confronting the biases that make transgender children targets of cruelty. Her mother became an advocate for mental health support and safety measures in schools. In the end, the trial did more than assign blame. It forced a reckoning. It revealed how cruelty can grow unnoticed, how societal blind spots can leave vulnerable teens unprotected, and how the darkest impulses can hide behind ordinary faces. Most of all, it reminded the world that Brianna was not a statistic, not a headline, but a child, a daughter, a friend, a girl who deserves safety, love, and a future. Her life was taken by deceit, but her memory endures because of the love she inspired and the injustice she suffered. And as the courtroom emptied and the sentences were handed down, the community carried forward a painful truth. Justice could punish the killers, but nothing could restore the life stolen in that quiet corner of a park.